When you stop eating dairy for 30 days, you are not going on a restriction diet. You are removing the most quietly defended ingredient system in the modern food supply, one that has been normalized since childhood, protected by decades of industry funding, and embedded into every meal pattern you were taught to consider healthy. Imagine a low-grade signal running continuously through your biology. Not dramatic, not obvious, a constant background noise in your gut lining, in your skin, in your sinuses, in your joints, in your hormonal balance. So consistent that you stopped noticing it years ago and started calling it your baseline. Every serving of dairy you eat maintains that signal. The mucus keeps building, the inflammation keeps ticking, the hormonal input keeps arriving, and your body keeps adapting around it, never fully recovering, never fully clear. This is not about lactose intolerance. That is the one dairy reaction the industry will acknowledge. This is about what dairy does to the biology of people who test negative for lactose intolerance, which is most of you watching this. The signal was not installed with bad intentions. It was installed by decades of nutritional advice, school programs, government food pyramids, and a dairy industry that spent over 40 years making sure every piece of research confirming its product's role in human health reached mainstream media, and every piece of research questioning that role did not. Now imagine what happens when you remove the signal for 30 days. The background noise stops. The body stops adapting around it. And for the first time in possibly decades, your gut, your skin, your sinuses, your hormones, and your immune system get 30 days without the constant input. And you finally learn what your actual baseline feels like. That is what these 30 days are. Not deprivation, not dairy phobia, a 30-day biological audit. A chance for your body to show you what it has been managing silently on your behalf. Today we are covering 5 things. What dairy is actually doing inside your body right now at the biological level, the 30-day timeline day by day, the 10 hidden effects nobody connects to dairy consumption, why the industry built this story and why mainstream nutrition is still telling it, and 3 pro tips for getting through the first 2 weeks without quitting. Stay until the effects section. The bloating, the sinus congestion, the skin problems, the hormonal issues, the joint aches, every single one of them has a biological connection to what dairy is doing inside you right now. Let's start the clock. Before the clock starts, you need to understand what dairy is actually doing inside your body, because this is not about calcium, and it is not about whether you are lactose intolerant. This is about 4 simultaneous biological mechanisms that operate whether you have symptoms or not. Dairy is a biological fluid produced by mammals to drive the rapid growth of a newborn animal. It contains a complex mixture of proteins, hormones, growth factors, and bioactive compounds specifically calibrated to promote cell proliferation, metabolic acceleration, and hormonal signaling in a rapidly developing organism. Human adults are the only species on Earth that consume the lactation product of a different species continuously across a lifetime. This is not a moral argument. It is a biological context for understanding what the substance actually is before it enters your gut. The first mechanism is insulin-like growth factor stimulation. Dairy is one of the most potent dietary stimulators of IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, in the human body. IGF-1 is a growth hormone that promotes cell proliferation. In children, this is the intended function. In adults, chronically elevated IGF-1 is independently associated with increased risk of hormone-sensitive cancers, accelerated skin cell turnover, meaning acne, and suppression of cellular autophagy, the body's process of clearing damaged cells. A 2012 review published in the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics confirmed that dairy consumption produces measurable and sustained elevations in circulating IGF-1 in adult humans, not just in children, not just in high consumers, but across normal dietary intake. Every glass of milk, every serving of cheese, every yogurt you eat elevates the growth signal. Your body is not designed to receive continuous growth signaling in adulthood. The consequences are slow and cumulative. The second mechanism is mucosal inflammation. Dairy proteins, specifically casein and whey, are among the most common dietary triggers of mucosal immune responses in people who are not classically allergic. Your mucosal surfaces, the gut lining, the respiratory tract, the sinus passages, the inner ear canals, are lined with an immune surveillance system that reacts to dietary proteins it identifies as potentially foreign. Casein, the primary protein in dairy, is specifically associated with mucosal IgA immune responses that do not show on standard allergy tests, but produce low-grade inflammation at every mucosal surface it contacts. The bloating, the mucus, the congestion, the chronic sinus issues, these are not unrelated symptoms. They are different expressions of the same mucosal immune response at different locations in the body. The third mechanism is hormonal input from dairy itself. Modern dairy production involves cows that are kept pregnant or recently postpartum for most of their productive lives, meaning commercial dairy contains measurable levels of estrogens, progesterone metabolites, and anabolic hormones that are biologically active in the human body. A 2010 study published in Pediatrics International confirmed that dairy consumption produced measurable increases in urinary estrogen and progesterone metabolites in both children and adults, and that the hormonal response was directly proportional to intake. These hormones are not destroyed by pasteurization. They arrive in your body with every dairy serving, interact with your own hormonal balance, and have been independently associated with acne, menstrual disruption, hormonal weight gain, and endocrine function changes in peer-reviewed research. The fourth mechanism is gut microbiome disruption from casein and lactose, even in non-intolerant individuals. Even people who produce adequate lactase, the enzyme that digests lactose, produce imperfect digestion of dairy proteins, and the partially digested casein fragments, known as casomorphins, interact with opioid receptors in the gut lining and alter gut motility, gut permeability, and microbiome composition independently of the lactose question entirely. These casomorphin peptides have been shown to slow gut transit, increase gut permeability, and interact with immune cells in the gut lining in ways that contribute to systemic, low-grade inflammation, independent of whether the consumer tests positive for lactose intolerance. The signal never stops running until you remove the source. Now the clock begins. Here is exactly what happens inside your body day by day when you remove dairy entirely for 30 days. Days 1 to 5, initial clearing and the withdrawal signal. In the first 5 days, your body will produce an uncomfortable paradox. Removing dairy, particularly for heavy consumers, triggers a casomorphin withdrawal effect. Casomorphins, the opioid-like peptides produced from casein digestion, have been activating opioid receptors in your gut and brain for years. Their removal produces a mild but real withdrawal pattern: increased cravings for dairy specifically, mood flatness, digestive disruption, and in some people, increased mucus production as the mucosal immune system initially ramps up before calming down. This is not your body telling you it needs dairy. This is your opioid receptor system adjusting to the absence of a dietary opioid it has been receiving multiple times per day. The dairy industry does not tell you this is happening. This is why cheese, specifically, is so difficult to remove from the diet, not because of its flavor profile alone, but because of its casein concentration and the casomorphin load it delivers per serving. Your gut microbiome begins noticing the change within 48 hours. Without dairy proteins and lactose continuously arriving, the microbial populations that process these substrates begin to shift. The change is not immediately comfortable. The microbial rebalancing produces transient digestive changes that many people interpret as the dairy removal making things worse. This is the opposite of what is happening. The disruption is reorganization, not damage. If you push through this, the first real shift becomes visible. Days 5 to 10. Mucosal clearing begins. By day 5 to 10, the mucosal immune response begins to settle. Without the continuous casein input arriving at your gut lining, respiratory tract, and sinus passages, the low-grade IgA immune activation at those surfaces begins to reduce. The first and most noticeable change for most people is the sinuses. The chronic baseline congestion that many people assume is either allergies or their normal state begins to lift. Not completely, but measurably. A 2015 clinical review published in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition compiled evidence from multiple elimination studies showing that dairy removal produced measurable reductions in self-reported upper respiratory congestion, mucus production, and sinus symptoms within 7 to 14 days, with the reduction beginning as early as 5 days in high dairy consumers. Your gut motility changes. Without casomorphin slowing gut transit, peristalsis, the muscular movement of food through the gut, begins to normalize. Many people notice changed bowel patterns in this window, either increased regularity if they were previously slow, or a settling period if they were already irregular. Both are signs of the gut transit system finding its own rhythm without the casomorphin brake applied. Your skin is beginning to respond below the surface. IGF-1 levels begin to drop within a week of dairy removal. The sebaceous glands in your skin, the glands that produce the sebum associated with acne, are directly regulated by IGF-1. As IGF-1 falls, the hyperactivation of sebaceous glands that produces the excess sebum load underlying hormonal acne begins to reduce. The skin change is not yet visible on the outside, but the biology driving the surface expression has already begun to shift. If you push through this, a more significant shift occurs. Days 10 to 17, inflammatory baseline begins to drop. By days 10 to 17, the compound effect of reduced IGF-1 signaling, reduced mucosal immune activation, and improved gut microbiome composition begins to produce measurable systemic changes. Systemic inflammatory markers begin to move. CRP, C-reactive protein, the primary marker of systemic inflammation, begins to decline. A 2014 randomized controlled study published in Nutrition Journal found that dairy elimination in adults with self-reported inflammatory symptoms produced significant reductions in CRP within 14 days, with improvements in bloating, joint stiffness, and fatigue scores that were independent of any other dietary change. Your skin becomes visibly different. The sebaceous gland response to falling IGF-1 is now showing at the surface. New acne lesions are forming less frequently. Existing inflammation in current lesions is resolving faster. For people with hormonal acne, specifically the jaw, chin, and lower face pattern associated with hormonal disruption, the change in this window is often the most dramatic they have experienced without pharmaceutical intervention. The joint stiffness that many people dismissed as age or fitness level begins to reduce. Dairy-associated mucosal inflammation is not confined to the gut and respiratory tract. The same IgA immune response that creates mucosal inflammation at the gut surface also affects synovial membranes, the fluid-producing lining of joints. The reduction in mucosal immune activation from dairy removal reduces the low-grade synovial inflammation that produces the morning stiffness, the aching, and the reduced range of motion that many people have been managing with anti-inflammatories or ignoring entirely. But here is where the science gets truly significant. By days 17 to 24, the hormonal input from dairy has cleared sufficiently for the body's own endocrine system to begin recalibrating without the external hormonal interference. In women, the reduction in exogenous estrogens and progesterone metabolites from dairy begins to allow the body's natural hormonal cycling to express itself without the additional hormonal load. Women who have experienced irregular cycles, PMS severity, or hormonally driven symptoms that did not respond fully to standard interventions frequently begin to notice a change in this window. The menstrual cycle is a finely calibrated endocrine system. External hormonal input, even at the low levels found in commercial dairy, disrupts the calibration. In men, chronically elevated dairy-derived estrogen metabolites contribute to the hormonal imbalance associated with reduced testosterone to estrogen ratios. The reduction in this external estrogen input after 17 to 24 days allows the body's own testosterone production to express without the estrogen competition. Changes in energy, mood, and body composition response to exercise begin to appear in this window. Your gut lining is beginning to heal at the structural level. Casomorphin-driven gut permeability increases have been reversing progressively since day one, but the structural repair of tight junction proteins between epithelial cells, the physical seal of the gut wall, becomes measurable in this window. A 2019 study published in the European Journal of Nutrition confirmed that dairy protein removal in individuals with elevated gut permeability markers produced measurable improvements in intestinal barrier function within 3 weeks. But here is where the science gets truly significant. By days 24 to 30, the compounding effect of reduced IGF-1 signaling, cleared mucosal immune activation, hormonal recalibration, and gut barrier repair produces the full system shift that makes this 30-day protocol so revealing. The systemic inflammation reduction is now measurable across multiple markers simultaneously. Not just CRP, but interleukin-6, the primary driver of chronic low-grade inflammatory signaling, has declined. Your immune system is no longer spending a significant portion of its daily resource allocation managing the mucosal IgA response to casein across your gut, sinuses, and respiratory tract. Your skin has undergone the most sustained sebaceous gland regulation it has experienced since before puberty. The hormonal acne cycle, driven by IGF-1 hyperactivation of sebaceous glands, compounded by dairy-derived hormone input, has been interrupted for almost a month. The bacterial environment of the skin has shifted in response to the changed sebum composition. Many people describe the skin change at day 24 to 30 as the first time they feel genuinely comfortable in their skin without pharmaceutical or topical intervention. Most significantly, your energy and cognitive clarity reach a new baseline. The combination of reduced systemic inflammation, improved gut barrier integrity, reducing the bacterial translocation that drives neuroinflammation, and hormonal recalibration produces improvements in sustained energy, mood stability, and cognitive clarity that many people attribute to sleep, stress, or other factors, and only connect to the dairy removal in retrospect when they experiment with reintroduction. Now, the 10 effects. Every single one is something you have been living with and blaming on the wrong cause. Effect 10. The chronic low-grade bloating you blame on eating too much or too fast. Your gut is responding to casomorphin-driven motility changes and partial casein digestion products arriving continuously. The bloating is not volume or speed. It is a specific response to a specific protein. Remove the protein for 30 days and the bloating resolves. Not the generalized bloating of overeating, but the specific persistent background distension that has been your post-meal normal for years. Effect 9. The chronic sinus congestion and post-nasal drip you blame on allergies, dust, or air quality. Your respiratory mucosal lining is maintaining a continuous IgA immune response to dairy proteins arriving at the mucosal surface via your bloodstream after every meal. The congestion is not environmental, it is dietary. Remove the stimulus and the mucosal immune activation settles. The congestion lifts. For many people, this is the most shocking effect of dairy removal. Clearer sinuses within 10 days for a symptom they had attributed to the external environment for their entire adult life. Effect 8. The hormonal acne, jaw, chin, lower face pattern, you blame on stress, genetics, or hormones you cannot control. IGF-1 directly activates the androgen receptor signaling in sebaceous glands that drives excess sebum production and comedone formation. Dairy-derived hormones compound this by adding exogenous estrogen and androgen precursors to the hormonal environment that regulates sebum production. Remove both inputs and the sebaceous gland hyperactivation that produces hormonal acne begins to resolve within 2 weeks and significantly clears within 30 days, without changing skincare, without changing sleep, without changing anything else. Effect 7. The joint stiffness and morning aches you blame on age, exercise habits, or dehydration. Synovial membranes, the lining of your joints, are mucosal tissue. The same IgA-mediated immune response that produces sinus and gut mucosal inflammation from casein also produces low-grade synovial inflammation. You have been managing this as a musculoskeletal issue when it is an immunological one with a dietary driver. Remove the driver and the synovial inflammation reduces. Morning stiffness clears. Joint comfort improves without anti-inflammatory medication. Effect 6. The skin conditions, eczema, rosacea, keratosis pilaris, you blame on genetics or environment. Eczema and rosacea have both been independently associated with gut permeability and the systemic inflammatory load from food-driven mucosal immune activation. Keratosis pilaris, the small rough bumps typically on the upper arms and thighs, is directly associated with IGF-1-driven keratinocyte hyperproliferation. All three have dietary drivers connected to dairy biology. Remove dairy for 30 days, and the improvement in these conditions that many people experience is not anecdotal. It is a predictable consequence of removing the biological inputs that were driving them. Effect 5. The menstrual cycle disruption, PMS severity, and hormonal irregularity you have been managing as a gynecological issue. Commercial dairy delivers a continuous, low-level hormonal input, estrogens, progesterone metabolites, anabolic hormones, into a system that regulates a precise hormonal cycle. Chronic exogenous hormonal input disturbs the cycle. Remove it for a month and the endocrine system, given space to calibrate without the interference, frequently produces a measurable improvement in cycle regularity, PMS symptom severity, and overall hormonal stability. This is not a cure. It is the removal of a disruption that was compounding the problem. Effect 4. The ear infections, glue ear, and chronic middle ear fluid you or your children blame on immunity or structural anatomy. The eustachian tube, the channel connecting the middle ear to the back of the throat, is lined with mucosal tissue that responds to the same IgA immune activation as the sinuses. Dairy-associated mucosal inflammation swells the eustachian tube lining, impairs drainage, and creates the stagnant fluid environment in which ear infections establish. The recurrent ear infections that lead to grommets and ENT referrals are, in a significant proportion of cases, driven by a dietary stimulus that no ENT clinic will mention because it falls outside the standard referral pathway. Remove dairy, reduce the mucosal swelling, and middle ear drainage improves. Effect 3. The persistent fatigue and low energy you blame on sleep quality, stress, or iron levels. Your immune system is spending a significant daily resource allocation managing the mucosal IgA response to dairy proteins across multiple body surfaces simultaneously. Immune activation is metabolically expensive. The fatigue that accompanies chronic low-grade immune engagement is not poor sleep. It is an energy cost that your immune system is charging your body for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Remove the stimulus, reduce the immune activation, and the metabolic resource that was allocated to managing it returns to you as sustained energy. Effect 2. The digestive irregularity, alternating constipation and loose stools, and IBS-like symptoms you have been managing with probiotics, fiber, and elimination diets targeting the wrong foods. Casomorphins, the opioid-like peptides from casein, directly slow gut transit via mu-opioid receptor activation in the gut lining. This produces constipation in some people and, when gut permeability is elevated, systemic inflammatory signaling that drives gut hypersensitivity and loose stools in others. The IBS diagnosis frequently does not identify the specific driver. Dairy elimination is one of the highest yield single dietary interventions for IBS symptom reduction. The research is consistent across multiple trials, yet it is not the first-line advice given in most GPs' offices. Effect 1. The sense that your body is running at 60%, that you are never fully well, never fully clear, never fully energized, and that this has simply become your normal. The low-grade mucosal inflammation, the continuous IGF-1 elevation, the chronic immune allocation to managing dairy proteins, the casomorphin interference with gut transit and opioid receptor signaling, the exogenous hormonal input from commercial dairy. These are not isolated effects. They are simultaneous systems, all running below the threshold of dramatic symptoms, all keeping your body's resources partially allocated to management rather than function. At day 30, when those systems are no longer engaged, people frequently describe feeling genuinely well for the first time in years. Not dramatically better, but fundamentally different. Baseline clear, baseline calm, the body running at a level they had stopped believing was available to them. Now, here is the part that should make you angry. The dairy industry is one of the most extensively government subsidized food sectors in the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, and across the European Union. In the United States alone, dairy subsidies, price support programs, and federal purchasing guarantees represent over $40 billion in government support since 1995. The governments that subsidize dairy production are the same governments that design the nutritional guidelines that recommend dairy consumption as a cornerstone of a healthy diet. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the documented structure of agricultural policy and nutritional guideline development in virtually every Western nation. The research funding structure compounds this. The majority of peer-reviewed research examining the health benefits of dairy is funded either directly by dairy industry bodies, in the United States, the National Dairy Council and Dairy Management, Inc., or by research institutions that receive significant dairy industry grants. A 2019 analysis published in PLOS One examined 168 dairy-funded studies and found that industry-funded dairy research was 5.3 times more likely to produce favorable conclusions than independently funded research on the same questions. Not slightly more likely, 5.3 times more likely. The research that confirms dairy's benefits reaches journals, press releases, and dietary guideline committees. The research that raises questions about dairy's biological effects in adults is published, but it does not travel the same pathway to mainstream nutritional advice. The calcium narrative is the central pillar of this structure. Generations have been told that dairy is the primary and essential source of calcium for bone health, a claim that is nutritionally inaccurate. Dark leafy greens, legumes, nuts, seeds, and fortified plant foods contain comparable or superior calcium bioavailability. Countries with the lowest dairy consumption globally, Japan, China, and most of sub-Saharan Africa historically, have among the lowest rates of osteoporosis. The countries with the highest dairy consumption, the United States, the United Kingdom, Scandinavia, have among the highest rates of osteoporosis and hip fracture in the world. This is called the calcium paradox, and it has been documented in epidemiological literature for decades. It never made it to the food pyramid. The IGF-1 evidence, the Casomorphin research, the mucosal immune studies, the hormonal content of commercial dairy, and the peer-reviewed connections between dairy consumption and acne, IBS, hormonal disruption, and recurrent ear infection. All of this research exists. None of it is fringe. None of it is contested at the level of mechanism. It simply does not appear in the mainstream dietary guidelines that governments publish and healthcare professionals are trained to deliver. They did not hide this because the science was weak. They hid it because the subsidy structure required it. 3 tips to get through 30 days without quitting. Tip 1. Replace the habit, not just the food. The most common failure point in the first week is not the food itself. It is the social and habitual context of dairy consumption. Tea and coffee with milk. Cheese as the automatic sandwich filling. Yogurt as the default breakfast. These are not nutritional decisions. They are habitual patterns with dairy embedded as the invisible default. The replacement strategy that works is not finding a willpower source. It is identifying the 3 or 4 daily habit patterns where dairy appears automatically and installing a specific alternative for each one before day 1 begins. Oat milk in coffee. Hummus and avocado as the sandwich filling. Overnight oats or fruit and nuts as the breakfast default. The alternative must be as automatic as the original. If you have to make a decision at the point of hunger, you will default to the habit. Remove the decision before the moment arrives. Tip 2. Manage the days 1 to 5 casomorphin withdrawal with deliberate protein. The withdrawal cravings of the first 5 days, particularly the cheese cravings, which are casomorphin-driven, are dramatically reduced by eating adequate protein from non-dairy sources at every meal. Protein from eggs, meat, fish, or legumes satisfies opioid-adjacent satiety signals that casomorphins were previously filling. The mechanism is not identical, but the practical effect is that high-protein meals in the first 5 days dramatically reduce the specific dairy cravings that cause early abandonment. Do not attempt the first 5 days on a low-protein or low-fat diet. The withdrawal requires nutritional bridging. Protein and fat are the bridge. Tip 3. Do not rely on labeling. Know the hidden dairy categories. Dairy appears in hundreds of processed food products under names that do not reference dairy directly. Casein, caseinate, whey, lactalbumin, lactoglobulin, ghee, lactose, and milk solids. If you switch from obvious dairy to processed foods containing these derivatives, you will not clear the system and you will not see the results. The rule is the same as whole food selection. If the ingredient list contains anything you cannot find in a kitchen as a recognizable food, investigate it. The single most reliable shortcut is to eat whole foods, foods with 1 ingredient or 5 recognizable ones, for the 30-day window. This approach automatically eliminates hidden dairy derivatives without requiring you to memorize an additive list. Whole food for 30 days. That is the protocol. 30 days. That is the window your body needed to show you what it has been managing on your behalf since childhood. You now know the bloating is casomorphin-driven gut motility disruption and casein immune response. The sinus congestion is dairy-associated mucosal IgA activation across your respiratory tract. The hormonal acne is IGF-1-driven sebaceous gland hyperactivation compounded by dairy-derived exogenous hormones. The joint aches are synovial mucosal inflammation from the same IgA response that produces your sinus congestion. The fatigue is the daily metabolic cost of running a continuous mucosal immune response at multiple body sites simultaneously. You cannot be sold the calcium story in the same way again. Remove, reset, reclaim. You are not giving up a food group. You are running a 30-day biological audit on a substance that has been embedded in your daily intake since you were old enough to hold a glass. One that was placed there by nutritional guidelines shaped by the industry that profits from your continued consumption, and kept there by a calcium narrative that the epidemiology has been contradicting for 30 years. If you are starting today, comment Day 1 below. Every person who comments is someone else who now knows what the mucosal response is, what the IGF-1 signal does, and what 30 days of removal actually reveals. And subscribe. Next, we are covering what happens to your body when you stop eating gluten for 30 days. The neurological effects go far beyond celiac disease, and the research is decades ahead of what your doctor has been told. You need to see it before your next slice of bread.